I've said before, I want to talk more and more about foreign policy. I think it is something that the left really does quite bad when it covers foreign policy. And I think you have an excellent example in the fact that you've had recently Keir Starmer have two big trips. Not only him himself, but David Lammy as well. What he's been doing pretty much has gone universally, I would say, ignored by the left. And what is, of course, Lammy and Starmer been doing? David Lammy has been zooming around, visiting all the European capitals constantly in this big sort of reset of our relations. And not only that, we've obviously had Starmer visiting Paris and Berlin. Now, why visit those two countries in particular? Well, if you look at, shall we say, the power dynamics of Europe, and I'm probably going to upset a lot of other people here, but this is true. If you look who are the most biggest influential sort of countries in Europe, it's the big three. It's Germany, France, and the UK. Like those are the big three. Those are the most biggest influential three countries here in Europe, to a point where if those three countries got together, for example, and went, hey, America, we need to sort of, you need to put pressure on Israel to sort of end this war and stop any further expansion because this is causing a big trouble in the Red Sea. It's having a big inflationary pressure on our European economies. You need to sort of, really start putting some pressure on and bring this to an end. I think that would be the kind of pressure that even America would not be able to ignore. But today we are going to have, a talk about this. And of course, Starmer's trip to Germany and the fact, it was a success. It was a really, really good success. I think some of the stuff announced about a bilateral agreement in defense, I think is nominally very, very, very good because as we are seeing in Europe, of course, in Ukraine, the real question asked, and of course, the worry of the threat of a not even just a return of Donald Trump, but maybe even a return of a Trump like figure, maybe in the future, has really raised questions in Europe to defend ourselves. When a lot of our defense preparation and how we looked at defense was the fact that we always knew that America would there and they would come to help. Well, that now has been called very, very much into question on this. And with Russia acting as it has been, the issue of defense has become an even more important question for European countries to answer. So this bilateral deal that we've got now with Germany, working with defense agreements, etc., I think is very, very good. I think it is an important step forward. And of course, eventually, you know, when we go to sort of the EU, when we go to sort of Brussels, or when Starmer does make that trip to Brussels, which eventually he will do, um, it will be good to then have the backing of both Germany and France potentially in those talks. You know, the big three. you know, hey, the big three is back, baby. And it is worth actually bringing up that when Rishi Sunak came to office, how long did it take him to go and visit some of these other countries, like especially European ones? He wasn't overly quick, and it wasn't until David Cameron got into office as the foreign secretary until he started going to do the rounds, visiting European countries. Did they feel that they had finally, oh, we exist now? It took, I think, Rishi Sunak over a year before he finally visited Germany. And that was paid attention to by, you know, German politicians and by people in, the diplomatic spheres. That it took over a year for him to actually go and visit Germany. So that was something that I think Starmer, bear in mind at this point, what, over a month, 50 what something days, I think, so far he's been in office, although what, 3 working weeks in parliament, but summer break and all that. I think that is good. I think, as I keep on, saying to people, resetting our relations with Europe should be seen by people in the UK and by Labour as a positive force for good. That this is a good thing to see those relationships be reset. Because it wasn't that too long ago where, German and UK relations were at an all-time low, especially during the Brexit period, where we saw, people like David Davis, well, actually, David Davis as a prime example. He'd be going to Europe and saying one thing, and then in the newspapers, he would come out and say something absolutely ridiculous. And this gave the impression to politicians and diplomats in Europe that you then could not trust the words of, the current UK government at the time, that they were an untrustworthy partner because they weren't really playing to sort of the big diplomatic audience in and around the world. They were far, far more interested in playing to the diplomatic crowd at home. That is now no longer the case. That is now no longer the case at all. And also, it is very, very worthwhile bringing up the poll that the Independent brought up as well. And that is, of course, the vast majority of Labour voters and members of the Labour Party want Starmer to ditch the Brexit red lines. That is a type of pressure, as I've said before, coming from businesses, coming from party members. Eventually, they cannot ignore. We've seen, of course, time and time again, the idea of youth mobility being brought up. Time and time and time again. It is not going away. But this is something that keeps on coming up in discussions. And we are now seeing a movement being built up here in the UK to put pressure on Starmer to accept that. So we are going to see, I think, a lot more diplomatic engagement with Europe, a lot more engagement with sort of European issues, and even eventually more engagement with the EU. Because at the moment, the EU is still trying to decide who's in charge after all these recent elections. They need commissioners electing, etc. That will happen, I believe. I want to say end of September, beginning of October, I think. So certainly then we'll start to see, I think, the UK have more engagement with the EU. And once again, I think, and bear in mind, I don't mean the EU as Europe. I mean the EU as the institution as it is. And I think that will be good. I think that will be very, very good to see those sort of relations built upon. As we've just seen positive relationships being rebuilt with, Paris and Berlin. So there is no reason to say that these relationships cannot be rebuilt. And of course, good things then come from them. But hey, as always, let me know what you think down below. But I cannot see how this trip to Germany was nothing but a huge success. I think it was a huge success for the UK. I think that once again, just as Joe Biden did after Trump to say, hey, America's back on the world stage. We aren't going to be, just ignore that. What happened for the past 4 years. We're back to re-engage in the world stage. I think this almost has been Starmer's sort of big reawakening, coming back, certainly bringing sort of the UK sort of more back towards a European sort of focused centrist direction. I know about all the other stuff, the CP, the agreements, etc. But as I've said before, I think in some cases those agreements are just so far along, pulling them now would cause a lot of diplomatic damage. And especially things like the Pacific Partnership, that only needs 6 months notice of withdrawal. So it's not hard to get out of. It's certainly more easier than the EU withdrawal process, that's for certain. But those issues, I'm sure, will come up in time and we'll end up discussing them. So, as always, let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you all next time.